Next up, we have an open source session with BSI and IEEE. I'd like to pass the mic over to Ivan, who will take us through this session. Ivan?
Thank you, Lakshmi. So I'm going to talk to you about Matthew Lewis, who, for those of you who know your Harry Potter, turned from a spotty oik youth to a very, this is the wrong, there we go, that's one, to a rather buff young man now that he's grown up. And this is exactly what's going on with open source. So I'm going to take you through a European perspective and then hand over to Adam he's going to explain what IEEE are doing, that they are more advanced in their work program than we are. So open source at the European level, there is a CEN-CENELEC project called Standards of the Future. You have already heard some of it today, and I think you're going to hear some more in the next session. Standards of the Future has a number of sub-projects, and one of those is open source innovation. The members of that project include AFNOR, BSI, DIN, NEN. It's actually chaired by DIN. And we have had a number of new members added this year. We've been running for a couple of years. We've been doing a bunch of research, looking at who else is working in open source standards and open source software as standards. We've analysed some use cases. We've run a small-scale pilot of an open source deliverable in the CEN-CENELEC arena. And we have made some recommendations to the CA, so the governing board of CEN-CENELEC, sorry, CEN and CENELEC separately, mustn't get them together. And we are looking to co-design a solution with open source communities, and we've just held a workshop to help kind of finalise an offer that we want to make to market in 2021. So the use cases that we've identified as relevant to formal standards world are the following. So we've seen a number of open source standards moving to the formal standards arena, and the primary driver of that appears to be a desire to gain market or regulatory acceptance. Those of you more familiar with standardization processes will know that there is the JTC1 fast track process, and this is often used by organizations like OASIS and OMG for their standards to be approved as formal ISO/IEC standards. The next use case we identified is where a formal standard is then taken into open source, and usually that's for implementation examples or reasons. And the driver of that, and there aren't many to be honest, is increasing interoperability across domains. While there aren't many examples, that is actually the use case we piloted at the European level. Then the last and probably most interesting use case we've identified is joint development. And this is where a technical document, a standard, is created as a normative deliverable, but then there is an open source component or implementation added to it. And there are multiple examples of this in the Etsy world and in other areas of open source. At the European level, there are a number of clear drivers, and the momentum is certainly accelerating for open source to become if not just accepted, it may well become the de facto software development method that is encouraged by at least the EU, if not individual member states. That's gone as far as there is now an EU open source software strategy. And there are a number of links on this slide. I think the slides are being distributed, so I do encourage you to have a look at some of these, particularly on this slide. And there's also a strong stakeholder demand. So, and this is from big business, not just from kind of the corporate side. So we've got Microsoft have made some big moves recently into open source. Their first move was in 2008, but that wasn't very well known. The biggest announcement they make on open source was probably a couple of years ago when they announced they were buying GitHub, which is one of the primary repositories for open source software development. Another thing we are seeing, another enabler, another driver, is emerging sectors and new business models. An emerging sector here is the open source hardware movement. For those of you not familiar with what this means, it's where a design or a pattern or a template is made in an open source fashion. It is driving particularly 3D manufacturing, 3D printing, but there is a thriving and growing open source hardware group. And in fact, the DIN have published a DIN spec on open source hardware, and that is on a copyleft license. So that's an interesting move from a established SDO. Another enabler is user-led demand, and this is where a bunch of industry actors get together to solve a common problem, and they do so by sharing and pooling IP. And we are seeing a number of open source consortia developing out of, if you like, the customer side. So not the business side. This is not the supply side. This is demand-driven consortia. Just on cue, the pneumatic drill starts outside. There are about 100 examples of open source consortia that we can evidence so far. Another driver, particularly in driven by things like the COVID response, whatever, is open data, and that's where there are a number of third sector and government agencies pushing for data to be shared openly amongst industry and academia. So that's the open data movement. We've also got the open science movement, and we've got things like Open Forum Europe, who are championing the development of open solutions in all its senses. Another enabler and another important kind of factor is just to determine the market maturity of open source now. So it's not just kind of Linux and kind of bits of the internet. It's also got its own compliance scheme. So OpenChain has just been adopted as an ISO standard that went through the fast track process, and that is certifying open source to a formal standard. And then there are important developments in both chip architecture and also autonomous vehicles with things like the RISC-V or the RISC-V consortium, and then Yocto. Yocto in particular is a very interesting one in autonomous vehicles. So these are all the kind of the good news, the buff muscles on the Matthew Lewis analogy, if you will. So then if we look at the constraints, the pimples and the spots that are holding us back. So we've got a number of issues here. The fairly common one is definitions and misunderstanding of different actors. So we have to continually explain the difference between open access, which means free, open source, which is about your permission to reuse the content. So it's a licensing and IP issue. And open standards. So open standards is about the transparency of the process by which you develop them. So lots of people confuse different things together, but open source is primarily a collaboration method that is incentivized by the sharing of IP. We have the standards side of things. We have a limited understanding of the open source model outside of software development, and we also have an equivalent problem on the other side. So open source communities are either mistrustful or don't see the need for formal standardization. There's an academic report I think I've linked to on one of the other slides that goes into a lot of detail in terms of the gap between open source and formal standards. Patents continue to be a concern in that standards have got a particular way of dealing with including patents in standards, whereas open source is generally, again, much more suspicious. We have some questions or concerns around how stable open source communities are and how long-lived they are. So then we have a governance concern. And then for formal standards bodies, we have an issue around business models. Obviously, most of us are publishers, and publishers by definition tend to exploit closed source IP, and open source is the exact opposite. At the CEN-CENELEC level, what we have agreed to, or what we are in the process of finalising, is a thing called the Open Workshop Agreement. There are equivalents at ISO in the International Workshop Agreement, and then the CEN-CENELEC level, the CEN Workshop Agreement or CENELEC Workshop Agreement. These are technically what are called low consensus deliverables, but they're generally delivered quite quickly by a invited group of experts. They sit outside generally the normal committee structures and have different maintenance and governance responsibilities. So they seem to suit our needs very well, but we're still kind of working through some of the legal and procedural aspects, and we are particularly kind of now struggling a little with the infrastructure and technology demands that these open source deliverables will take on us, will place on us. And this is where I think in particular it will be interesting to hear from IEEE, who are more actively working on that side of things. So at that point, my next slide is simply to say how you can get in touch with me if you want to, but I will now hand over to Adam Newman from SA Open.
Thanks, Ivan. So I'm our Senior Director of Innovation and Development and Operations, for those who don't know me. Salona Bonewald, who came to us from Hyperledger, isn't with us today, but I included her on these slides because she's the ED of our SA Open project. So we've been working for about 5 years to bring to fruition open source in the Standards Association, addressing some of the problems and that I'm sure Ivan talked about with regard to how to make open source work for standards development and for technologies related to standards development. We too started out at the use case level, so our advisory groups identified a number of use cases that we sought out to address in our project. The ranging from open source code as a normative standard itself or as a normative reference in a standard, through to our members, our 400,000 members, and doing projects for the benefit of humanity, whether they're open source software or open source hardware or related implementations. So we had the advantage of having a couple of incubation platforms available to us to allow us to iterate agilely on our development of open source solutions. So we were able to pilot solutions for a number of our programs. We actually, as it turned out, and unsurprisingly, had a number of standards working groups that were working in open source methodologies to produce the contents of our standards in any case. And they were sort of working aside or beside us in our normal standards development procedures, rather than on platforms that we provided them in order to enable their work. And so we were able to bring those in, use them as pilots, learn for them in order to set up our open source procedures and platform. We added some personnel with open source expertise onto my team to really help with that process and develop that process, along with our volunteers who were experts in both the standards development processes, both in our organization, but also working in other organizations around the world, including, ISO, JTC1, etc. One of the biggest, and I think Ivan talked about this a little bit, one of the biggest poles in the tent, so to speak, when you're putting up a open source program as it relates to standardization is intellectual property rights and how they impact. Open source can vary incredibly widely from a pure public, no rights are allowed open source in sort of a new public license, for example, through to something like, Apache or BSD3 clause, which allows the possibility, the latter, of patent rights in a project. So we worked with our groups, our industry groups, and with our legal department and a number of outside experts, and we eventually approved 3 licenses, 2 of which I show here. An Apache license, the Apache 2.0, the BSD3 clause license, and for hardware CERN license that we've recently approved for use in our projects. But it's more than that. We also then had to develop incoming contributor license agreements, because for our standards projects, we needed to have assurance that, or at least some level of assurance, that the code or technology work that was being contributed to a project, the contributor had rights and was willing to assign those rights for the proper outbound open source rights. So, and when we set up our platform, there's always the possibility that open source comments to a project have technical merit and therefore are contributions to the project. So we also had to have the potential of commenters to a standard having a contributor license agreement that was appropriate to the project they were commenting on. And we had to put a system in place to track all that so that whenever we produce an open source containing standard or an open source project, all the contributions had the appropriate distribution rights. And it's a fairly significant effort to be undertaken, and hopefully we can help some of our colleagues here implement like we have. So the other significant effort for us was on the governance side. We had to marry our standards governance process to open source governance and open source projects. And it is a little bit of apples and oranges in some ways, but in other ways, open source projects sometimes struggle for some guidance and oversight so that they can be implemented by industry the way standards are implemented by industry. And so we formed an open source committee under our board of governors that is open source in nature. And they approved a maintainer's manual with a set of policies and procedures, including some of the IPR policies and procedures I talked about in the last slide, that all of our official projects would have to accept and play by. It's fairly high level, but it's in open source project language, but reviewed and approved by and fit in to our standards governance procedures. Again, that probably took the better part of a year of work to do and to get at least initially right. I do believe we'll have to agilely iterate on it on a going forward basis. And we also had to work with our standards board, who does our normal standards approval, for changes to their operations manuals and procedures so that our standards could reference an open source repository that was approved as part of the standard, but open source repositories have to have procedures to being updated on an ongoing basis. You can't have a standard that is a set of software that you can't update for a variety of reasons, but not the least of which is potential security issues or other underlying infrastructure issues that need cared for immediately if they're deployed in the real world. And we had to marry those two processes. And again, that took a little while. But in December 2019, we actually published our first standard with a reference to an open source repository. That's IEEE 1076, by the way, if anybody feels like going and looking at it. So to marry and to provide a platform for our standards developers and our open source community, we've put together a platform. It consists of what we call a community in the box. An open source community or project can come in and immediately set up a repository and start doing work with a GitLab instance, a team, Mattermost, which is kind of open source Slack for those of you who aren't familiar. We're piloting an open source video conferencing tool called Big Blue Button, and project management, and, source code monitoring, reporting, and lots more. Next slide. The real thing here is that if we're going to do this for our official projects that are going to be adopted by industry and used as a standard source, it has to be done right, and it has to be done sustainably. And so our instance has a lot of features that can be used by real projects in the real world in production. And we chose to go with an open source solution as part of our open source project, which was GitLab, because quite frankly, since it's open source, we can control, and our projects can control, what features are included in their instances and what ones aren't. Whereas some of the other commercial potential SCM solutions, source code management solutions, you are sometimes dependent on them to roll out features rather than being able to select. So that's why we went this way. And then as we develop new features, we're actually giving back to the GitLab community itself, so other communities can roll it out with GitLab open source. So we've got, since February when we soft launched this, we've gone from 10 pilot projects or a dozen pilot projects to more than 150 projects on the platform. And I did these numbers a couple months ago. We're up to about 1,500 participants that have accounts on the platform, and some significant percentage of which are actively participating in projects. We have about 15 standards projects among those 150 projects, where we have standards community developing normative code related to a standard on a going forward basis. And some significant percentage, somewhere between 10 and 20% of our new standards projects are looking to use the open source platform. So this is a significant piece of our community, and it's one of the fastest growing pieces of our community. I covered everything else on this slide, except that we did, you can leave it. We did have to make an update, or chose to make an update to our My Project workflow system for our standards, so that we had the right information for our projects in the workflow system with regard to selection of a license type, noting that it's open source, the ability to have a reference to the opensource.ieee.org code repository for the projects. And we also updated our database to flow through to our publication system, IEEE Explorer. So on IEEE Explorer, if there is a open source repository related to the standard, there's a clickable link in Explore to that repository for that standard. So it sort of all ties together. Sorry, now the next slide, which is more of a things that we're as an industry, including IEEE, we're going to have to deal with. What's the business model, right? We project services for those productized implementations where where the standards project is an implementation that industry is using. Though there will be services there that the industry needs to keep that project up and running, a la Hyperledger, which is where my ED is from. Value-added products, we believe there will be some interesting e-learning and other opportunities that grow out of our open source platform. And I think there are also going to be new outputs. How we layer this with our standards output, I think, is going to be interesting both for IEEE and the industry at large. How's open source going to affect all of us going forward? How's it going to affect our subscriptions? I think that remains to be seen. It's certainly not going to be all of our projects that are open source, and right now it is open source. We're not restricting access to any of the projects on the platform. We've actually seen membership increase slightly on the individual basis, and I think that we'll see membership also increase on the entity basis as we develop more and more open source projects, and we're certainly getting an increase in new projects, and a percentage of them are there because they can do open source here. So I think that all of us are going to have to see how this impacts our business model, and how it affects our users and our businesses. I think that this is my last slide, so I think now it's up to for questions between and for Ivan and I.
So Adam, hi, this is Lakshmi. We did have one question for you from Todd Carpenter at NISO. How does IEEE manage the collection of contributor agreements? Is it a click-through? Is it a written wet ink statement of release, or is it something else?
Yes, so it's a little bit of both. For the unofficial projects, just to get in and use the platform, there's a click-through terms of use that includes a basic contributor license agreement for anybody that's contributing on any of the general open non-official projects. For the official projects, so standards themselves or other official projects that IEEE is going to support from a software code and services perspective, there we collect actual contributor license agreements. It doesn't necessarily need to be paper ink. E-signature is fine, but we do collect, store, and record in a database system those agreements. Those agreements can be individual, entity, depending on the project and the project type, and they can be specific to a project or general to the platform. So that's why I noted on one of my slides, you have to have a system to deal with it.